Gentle jazz music plays softly in the background. In the heart of Africa, atop one of Rwanda's 1,000 green hills, there stands a hotel, the Hotel des Mille Collines in Kigali. My name is Paul Rusesabagina, and I was the manager of that hotel in 1990s. This is my story. It is a tale of ordinary people caught in the most extraordinary of horrors, and how a simple hotel became a sanctuary during one of history's darkest chapters. I invite you to join me on a reflective journey, told in a calm and hushed voice, as if we were speaking late at night. Together, we will walk through memories of peace and of unimaginable violence, through nights of fear and days of courage, and finally, into the dawn of a new day. I will speak to you as if whispering a bedtime story, slowly, gently, but with honesty. Though the subject is painful, I will guide you carefully, focusing on humanity and hope, even as I recount real events and dates from the 1994 Rwandan genocide. Before we begin, picture a quiet evening in Kigali in early 1994. I was a hotel manager, a husband, and a father. I was also a Rwandan of mixed heritage, Hutu by my father, Tutsi by my mother. In Rwanda, these identities of Hutu and Tutsi had taken on deadly importance. For generations, Hutu and Tutsi lived together, even intermarried, speaking the same language and sharing the same land. Often, you couldn't tell who was who just by looking. And in my own family, the line was blurred. My father a Hutu, my mother a Tutsi, my wife Tatiana a Tutsi, our children a blend of both. Yet by 1994, being Hutu or Tutsi had tragically become the difference between life and death. As I speak to you, I will sometimes pause to ground the story with dates, names, and places. All of these events truly happened, though I will spare the graphic details. Instead, I will focus on what it felt like. The anxiety in the pit of my stomach, the resolve I clung to, the quiet acts of bravery and compassion that flickered against the darkness. Imagine my voice steady and soft, guiding you through each scene. Picture the hotel's dim hallways at night, refugees huddled together on the floor, and me walking those halls, checking on everyone by the glow of a flashlight. Outside, the world was falling apart. But inside the Mille Collines, we tried to hold on to an illusion of safety. So relax and listen as I recount how one hotel manager, an ordinary man, saved hundreds of lives while the world was silent. This is a story of Hotel Rwanda, before and after. It is a story of horror, yes, but also of hope and humanity. And though it is a long story, 2 hours or so of gentle narration, I promise to speak calmly and slowly. If you drift asleep as I speak, That's all right. I'll keep watch and continue the story. After all, there was a time I stayed awake through many nights to keep others safe. I remember life in Kigali before the trouble began. The year was 1994, and Rwanda was a beautiful country, often called the land of 1,000 hills. My days were filled with the routine of hotel management, greeting international guests in the lobby with a warm smile and a slight bow, checking that the rooms were impeccably made up and ensuring the kitchen served its best dishes. The Hotel des Mille Collines was a 4-star hotel, the pride of Kigali's hospitality. From the 4th-floor restaurant, you could gaze out at our capital city, tree-studded hills rolling into the distance. Tourists and business people from Europe and Africa sat on the terrace, sipping on Rwandan coffee or cold Primus beer, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. We in the hotel staff took great pride in our work and in our country's reputation as a scenic, orderly place. Yet, beneath that tranquil routine, Rwandan society carried deep scars. The divide between Hutus and Tutsis had been stoked by history and politics. During colonial times, Belgian rulers issued identity cards labeling people as Hutu or Tutsi, reinforcing a social division that had existed in more fluid forms for centuries. Stereotypes took hold. Tutsis were often described as taller and thinner, Hutus as shorter and stronger. In truth, many Rwandans didn't fit those descriptions at all. Our people had intermarried and lived together for ages. My own existence was proof of that blend. Still, extremist propaganda would have had us believe we were utter opposites. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, tensions grew. A civil war had broken out in 1990 when a rebel army of mostly exiled Tutsis called the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, invaded, seeking to overthrow the Hutu-led government. After years of on and off fighting, a peace agreement known as the Arusha Accords was signed in August 1993. The Accords promised power sharing and the return of Tutsi refugees. We dared to hope that peace was coming. The United Nations sent a small peacekeeping force, UNEMAIR, to help implement the accords. I remember seeing UN soldiers in their pale blue helmets on the streets of Kigali in late 1993. Their presence was reassuring at first. But even as diplomats talked of peace, others prepared for war. Throughout late 1993 and early 1994, a shadow of fear crept over daily life. Militant Hutu extremists, adherents of what was called Hutu power, spread poisonous propaganda. A new radio station, RTLM, Radio Télévision Libre des Mille Collines, began broadcasting hate-filled messages day and night. I would sometimes tune in to RTLM and feel a chill at the venom in their jokes and songs. They called Tutsis Inyenzi, meaning cockroaches, and told listeners that these cockroaches were plotting to enslave or kill Hutus. It sounded outrageous, but many believed it. I heard that militias were being organized, arms distributed. There were whispers that hardliners in the government had compiled lists of Tutsi enemies. Indeed, reports later confirmed that by early 1994, extremist leaders had stockpiled weapons and drawn up names of people to be eliminated, all in preparation for something terrible. As a family man focused on work, I tried to dismiss these dark portents, but a sense of dread sometimes kept me up at night. At the hotel, however, life went on normally. I was actually the assistant manager at the Mille Collines back then. And I had recently also been put in charge of our sister property, the Diplomat Hotel, Hotel des Diplomates. The Mille Collines was owned by Sabena, a Belgian airline company, which meant we often hosted European travelers and dignitaries. We Rwandans prided ourselves on being hospitable and orderly. If you visited Kigali in early 1994, you'd find paved streets, busy markets, and our hotel's pool sparkling under the sun. I lived with my family in a comfortable home in the city. My wife Tatiana was a former nurse, kind and strong. We married in 1989. Between us, we had children to look after, including my kids from a previous marriage and a young son, Tresor, whom Tatiana and I had together. Tatiana was Tutsi. In those days, that fact worried me sometimes, given the hateful rhetoric on the radio. But in our private life, it meant nothing. We loved each other fiercely, just as any husband and wife. Our neighbors and friends were both Hutu and Tutsi. We hosted dinners where everyone laughed and shared brochettes, grilled meat skewers, and ibinyobwa, peanut sauce, without a thought of ethnicity. Rwanda was our common home. Still, I could not entirely ignore the clouds gathering on the horizon. In January 1994, the UN force commander in Kigali, a Canadian general named Romeo Dallaire, reportedly warned his superiors that an extermination campaign was being planned. He had even learned of lists of targets. But the UN in New York denied him permission to act proactively. International diplomats clung to the Arusha peace plan and did not want to believe that a genocide was looming. Meanwhile, RTLM radio continued its toxic broadcasts, and street tensions simmered. Some nights, we heard political rallies in the distance, with chants that made us uneasy. Yet, nothing could have fully prepared us for what happened on April 6, 1994, the night the world around us changed forever. April 6, 1994 was an ordinary Wednesday until it wasn't. I remember that day vividly. Kigali had been calm. Though there was an undercurrent of political strain, the new power-sharing government was overdue to be formed, and hardliners were angry about it. That evening, Tatiana and I put the children to bed in our home. We planned to have a quiet night. As I settled into an armchair, possibly with a cup of Rwandan tea, the phone rang with startling news. President Juvenal Habyarimana's plane had been shot down out of the sky. It was roughly 8:30 p.m. The presidential plane, returning to Kigali from a summit, exploded in a ball of fire as it approached the airport. Everyone on board was killed. President Habyarimana, the president of neighboring Burundi, Cyprian Ntaryamira, and others. We didn't yet know who fired the missile that struck the plane, but within minutes, the blame was cast. Hardline government military officers and radio announcers began accusing the Tutsi rebels, the RPF, of assassinating our president. I remember stepping outside and seeing an orange glow on the horizon in the direction of the airport. It was the burning wreckage, though I didn't know it then. Tatiana clutched my arm. "This is very bad," she whispered. I nodded, heart pounding. We both sensed that the fragile peace had just been shattered. President Habyarimana, a Hutu, had been the one signing the peace deal with the Tutsis under international pressure. His death was the spark that the extremists had been waiting for, or even perhaps planning for, to unleash what they had been promising on the radio. Extermination. Within hours, our worst fears came true. In the late night and early hours of April 7th, gunfire erupted throughout Kigali. The Presidential Guard and militias set up roadblocks around the city. They had lists of names. House to house, they began hunting down people, Tutsis and moderate Hutu politicians, and killing them. The Rwandan genocide had begun, literally the same night as the plane crash. I didn't sleep at all that night. We barricaded our door and gathered the children in one room. I tried to reassure them with a steady voice, but my mind was racing. Through the darkness, we heard sporadic gunshots pop, pop, pop in the distance, then closer. Occasionally, an explosion thumped dully, making the ground tremble. From my window, I saw an orange glow against the night sky in a few directions. Houses on fire. Dogs were barking wildly, then would fall eerily silent. At around 3 a.m., the national radio, Radio Rwanda, announced that a crisis committee had taken control of the government. In essence, a military coup by extremist Hutu leaders was underway. The announcers used coded words, urging people to do their work and clear the brush. These were euphemisms meaning, "Kill the Tutsis." Meanwhile, RTLM radio gleefully reported that the graves are not yet full and encouraged listeners to hunt down their Tutsi neighbors. It was surreal and horrifying to hear these broadcasts, their hateful rhetoric now transformed into direct orders for mass murder. When dawn broke on April 7, 1994, Kigali was a different world. Almost all hell had broken loose. I ventured a peek outside our gate. The street was littered with debris. A few houses down, I saw a figure lying in the road. I squinted and realized It was a person, perhaps dead, though I dared not go closer to check. We heard screams and frantic crying from nearby homes. I knew many of our neighbors were Tutsi. They were being dragged out or worse. Fear, like I had never known, filled me. I must protect my family. Tatiana, being Tutsi, and the children, who would be seen as half Tutsi, were now targets of the killers. And even though I, Paul, was Hutu by identity card, my stance against the violence and my marriage to Tatiana effectively put me in danger too. Extremists considered people like me traitors or cockroach lovers, and moderate Hutus were indeed being slaughtered alongside Tutsis. We huddled together, praying and trying to think what to do. The roads were controlled by militias at checkpoints, checking IDs. A Tutsi ID card at a roadblock meant instant execution. So fleeing the city by car was impossible. Many of our friends who tried to run were chased down. As President Clinton would later describe it, people were hunted down as they fled through farmland and woods as if they were animals. Even those who sought refuge in churches or schools were not spared. The killers would find them in those supposed sanctuaries and massacre them. Nowhere in Kigali seemed safe, except, perhaps, places under international watch. And one such place was the Hotel de Mille Collines. I thought of the Mille Collines right away. The hotel had foreign ownership, and at that moment, it hosted many expatriates, European, Canadian, etc., who had gathered there for safety. In fact, on the first day of the genocide, Western nationals in Kigali were told to convene at a few secure points for possible evacuation. And the Mille Collines Hotel was one such assembly point. I recall hearing, over a crackling radio, that French and Belgian soldiers were arriving at the airport not to halt the violence, but to evacuate their citizens. Indeed, by April 9th and 10, those foreign troops airlifted Western expatriates out of Rwanda, whisking them to safety while leaving Rwandans behind. In the early hours of April 7th, however, those foreigners were still at the Mille Collines awaiting rescue. For Rwandans like us, the departure of those foreigners would remove even the thin veneer of restraint against the killers. We knew once the international witnesses were gone, the militias would feel free to kill everyone remaining. This meant time was short. We needed to reach a point of relative safety quickly, ideally before the UN or foreign military presence vanished completely. That morning, April 7th, something happened that sealed our decision. Around mid-morning, a group of Rwandan soldiers came to my home. We tensed up as they banged on the door. To my surprise, they did not immediately threaten us. Instead, they had a peculiar request. They knew I was a hotel manager. They demanded that I go with them to open the Hotel des Diplomates, The other hotel I managed because they wanted to use it as their military headquarters. The interim Hutu extremist government was convening, and they desired the diplomates, a smaller, upscale hotel, as a base of operations. This was an order I couldn't refuse. I negotiated with the soldiers that my family must come with me. I would not leave my wife and children alone in this chaos. They grudgingly agreed. When we arrived at the diplomats' hotel, I unlocked it for the soldiers. They promptly made it a barracks and command post. In those first hours, I was in extreme stress. Soldiers and militiamen swarmed the place. They eyed Tatiana and my children with open hostility, for they could see my wife's Tutsi features. I realized we were essentially hostages. To ensure our cooperation and safety, I resorted to something I knew well from my profession: providing hospitality. I went to the hotel's bar and took out bottles of good Scotch whiskey, beer, anything I could find. With a trembling smile, I offered drinks and politely chatted with some of the soldiers who had come with orders to kill. I even managed a joke or two, playing the genial host. This disarmed them a little. They were likely astonished. In truth, every passing minute, I expected one of them to turn on us. But miraculously, they didn't. I also had access to the hotel's safe, where money was kept. Quietly, I slipped some cash into the hands of the officers, bribing them for our well-being. I recall saying something like, "Please, take this and have your men guard the hotel gates so no looters come in. My family and I are at your service." The soldiers accepted the bribe. In that moment of desperation, cheese, wine, whiskey, and cash were my only weapons, small luxuries that I traded for mercy. Astonishingly, it worked. Those men indulged in the liquor and momentarily forgot the task of killing. By treating them as honored guests rather than mortal threats, I managed to delay their murderous intent. This unexpected tactic of mine, extending hospitality to killers, would become a pattern in the days to come. It was not a strategy I had planned, but rather an instinct honed by years of hotel management. When faced with angry or difficult patrons, respond with courtesy and generosity. Now my patrons were genocidal soldiers. For the rest of that day, April 7th, heavy fighting raged in Kigali between government forces and the invading RPF rebels, who had launched an offensive to try to stop the genocide. Artillery shells whistled overhead occasionally. By evening, the situation at the diplomats grew tense. The government leaders, using the hotel as a headquarters, were alarmed by how quickly the Tutsi-led rebels were advancing into the city. The RPF, led by a commander named Paul Kagame, was attacking strategic points in Kigali. In response, government troops at the diplomats began to evacuate that hotel. They told me they were moving to a new base outside the city center. They eventually relocated the interim government to a town called Gitarama. As they packed up, I saw an opportunity and took it. I asked one of the officers if my family and I could leave as well, to go to the Milcolin Hotel. Perhaps it was the whiskey or the bribes, or perhaps simple disinterest. But they agreed to let us go. It was now April 8th, 1994, and the soldiers provided us a truck to travel across town. I later learned that I wasn't the only one thinking of the Mille Collines. Many people in Kigali, especially Tutsis and those in danger, were converging there. They believed that a large hotel, possibly with UN presence and many foreigners, might be spared the carnage. We drove through chaotic streets. Kigali, which had been so tidy and peaceful just 2 days before, now looked like a war zone. Roadblocks manned by militiamen appeared every few hundred meters. Each time, my heart nearly stopped. Angry young men with rifles or machetes would flag down the truck. I would lean out, smiling, waving a document or hotel ID, shouting, "Hotel staff, evacuating," in Kinyarwanda. Twice we were made to get out. I showed them that I was Hutu, my identity card, which, unbelievably, I remembered to carry, listed me as Hutu, and that I was escorting some relatives. I prayed they wouldn't recognize Tatiana's Tutsi features or question the children. Miraculously, with a combination of Hutu identity papers, cigarette bribes, and sheer bluff, we were allowed to pass. I will never forget the sights on that drive. Burned vehicles, smoldering on roadsides, clusters of frightened civilians hiding behind walls, and far too many bodies lying in yards and gutters. In some places, dogs or pigs, the only ones unafraid to roam, sniffed at the remains. I steeled myself, focusing straight ahead, and gently told my kids to cover their eyes and stay low. No child should ever see such things. At one checkpoint, a militiaman noticed my wife's lighter complexion and narrowed his eyes. "Is she Tutsi?" he barked. My blood froze, but I managed to laugh and replied, "No, no, she's my wife, a good Hutu woman from the north." It was a lie. Everyone knew Tatiana was Tutsi. But with God's grace, the man accepted it after a tense pause. He motioned us on. Perhaps the frenzy to kill hadn't fully reached every checkpoint yet, or perhaps we simply met a lazy guard. Either way, we survived that moment. I felt sweat trickling down my back as we drove away. Finally, we pulled into the driveway of the Hotel des Mille Collines. It was now April 8th. The scene there was one of frantic activity. Crowds of people were gathered at the hotel gates, pleading to be let in, mostly Tutsi civilians and some moderate Hutus who feared for their lives. Many had come from nearby neighborhoods where massacres had begun. I saw families with a few hastily grabbed belongings, mothers holding babies, men with their shirts torn and faces etched in terror. The hotel's security guards, those who had stayed on duty, were overwhelmed and unsure what to do. Inside the gates, I glimpsed UN armored personnel carriers parked and a handful of UN soldiers standing guard. There were indeed a few UN peacekeepers at the hotel, unarmed observers from countries like Ghana and Senegal, as well as some Belgian officers who'd been staying as guests. Their blue UN flag flew outside, giving the refugees a ray of hope. Perhaps the killers would hesitate to attack a place under UN guard. However, I knew the truth. These UN soldiers were symbolic protection at best. There were only a handful of them at the Mille Collines, and they had orders not to use force except to save themselves or foreign nationals. In fact, only days later, the United Nations would drastically cut its peacekeeping contingent in Rwanda from the original 2,500 troops down to a mere 250, a token force with no mandate to stop the genocide. Already on April 8th, many UN troops were busier organizing foreign evacuations than protecting Rwandan civilians. Still, in that desperate hour, even a little UN presence cast a protective aura over the hotel. Locals were saying, "The Mille Collines is safe. The UN is there. White people are there." We managed to get inside the compound. I cannot describe the relief that washed over me as we crossed that threshold. It was as if crossing from hell into a sanctuary. But I also knew this sanctuary was precarious, a temporary bubble of safety amid the carnage. The hotel was not designed to be a fortress, just a luxury refuge. Its safety depended largely on perception and connections. I immediately sought out the senior person in charge. The Mille Collines' Belgian general manager had already evacuated. He had fled when things turned violent. So the remaining staff, clerks, cooks, cleaners, were essentially leaderless and frightened. In the lobby, I saw familiar faces, hotel employees who knew me from my assistant manager role. They looked at me with a mix of hope and desperation. It's strange. I had come seeking refuge myself, but instantly I was regarded as someone who could provide refuge. It dawned on me that I might be the most senior hotel staff member left on site. The first thing I did was to use the hotel's phone lines to reach Sabina, the company headquarters in Brussels. Miraculously, the phone line was still working. The militias had cut many telephone lines around the city, but a few still functioned, or the fax line did. I got through to Sabena executives in Belgium. I explained the situation. The Mille Collines was swamped with people needing protection. The manager was gone, and I was on the scene. I implored Sabena to officially put me in charge as acting general manager of the Mille Collines. They agreed. A fax came through shortly after, confirming my appointment as temporary manager. With that paper in hand, I had the authority I needed to organize and negotiate on the hotel's behalf. Thus, by fate and circumstance, I became the de facto guardian of the Miller Colleen refugees. It was April 8th, 1994, and I now oversaw a hotel that was fast turning into a crowded camp for the desperate. Over the next few days, more and more people would pour in. Eventually, we sheltered approximately 1,268 people, both Tutsis and some Hutus, who were in danger, within the hotel's walls. Not one of those refugees would be killed or taken away while under our protection. But at the time, I did not know how we could possibly manage that. I only knew that I had to try. The scene: the lobby of the Hotel des Mille Collines, mid-April 1994. The marble floor is scuffed and crowded with people. Luggage, mattresses, and cooking pots are strewn about. A crystal chandelier hangs above refugees sleeping on the couches. In those first days at the hotel, everything was improvised. Families occupied suites and conference rooms. People slept 10 to a bedroom, even on hallway floors and under tables. Children cried in confusion. Parents shushed them gently. For me, the story of Hotel Rwanda is not just about one man or one hotel. It's about the capacity for good that flickers in the darkest times, and a reminder of the consequences when the world averts its eyes. There is a saying, never again. After the Holocaust of World War II, the world said, never again would we allow genocide. And yet, it happened again, in Rwanda, while the world stood by. We must be vigilant that it never happens yet again, to any people, anywhere. That is why I continue to share my story, so that you, dear listener, carry a piece of it in your memory, and with it, an understanding of our shared responsibility to act with compassion and courage. As you drift off to sleep, think not only of the horrors I described, but also of the acts of kindness. The soldier who spared his childhood friend, the staff who risked their lives to cook meals for refugees, the guests who shared their last biscuit with a stranger, the baby born in a hotel room who proved that life can blossom even amid death. Think of the calm that eventually came after the storm. The quiet dawn of July 1994, when we stepped outside the Mille Collines alive, blinking at the sunlight, having endured the long night. In that dawn, I felt the slightest stirring of hope. Yes, we had seen the worst of humanity, but we also witnessed the best. And perhaps that is the enduring message of this story. Even when humanity is at its lowest, even when the world falls silent and abandons you, you can still find a voice within to say, no, I will not be a bystander to evil. You can still reach out and save your neighbor, protect your family, and uphold dignity. I often describe myself as an ordinary man. I wasn't a soldier or a politician or a saint. I was a hotel manager. My tools were not weapons, but words, drinks, and diplomacy. Yet, with those simple tools, I managed to do what little I could, and that little meant everything to those 1,268 people who survived. None of them were killed under my roof. If there is any lesson here, it's that one does not need to be extraordinary to make a difference. One just needs to do what is right, with whatever means one has, when faced with extraordinary evil. I will end now with a final thought spoken softly from my heart. I think of the many friends and family I lost in 1994. I close my eyes and see their faces, laughing at a dinner table, or waving goodbye on a Sunday, or hiding in terror in my memory's last glimpse of them. I want them to know you were not forgotten. Even as the world was silent, some of us did speak your names. We kept you alive in memory and tried to save those we could in your honor. And to the world, I say, please remember Rwanda. Remember how silence and indifference can kill. But also remember the Mille Collines, the Hotel Rwanda, where one small beacon of humanity shone in the darkness. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it has gently guided you through a journey of understanding. And now, at its end, perhaps you feel a sense of calm knowing that even in the face of unspeakable horror, goodness and love can prevail. I will bid you good night or good rest now. Murabeho. That means goodbye in Kinyarwanda. May you sleep in peace, under a safe roof, and may we all strive for a world where no one ever has to endure what we did in those fateful 100 days. Never again, we pray. Never again. Silence. Then the soft notes of a lullaby play as the narrative fades, leaving the listener in quiet contemplation.